So here's an interesting fact of history. Time-keeping devices, the technologies for keeping daily time, came into the world at the same time and the same place as when and where Judaism came into the world. Interesting. The earliest sundials and the earliest water clocks were found from Egypt to Babylonia from the year 1500 BCE. Now, this could just be a coincidence, but Jewish historians are wondering about it, and I wonder about it too. It's fair to say that Judaism is obsessed with marking time and sanctifying time. From the very beginning of the Torah, we hear it. There was evening, there was morning, the first day, vayi erev, vayi voker. There was evening, there was morning, the second day, and so on. The march of time begins. With the first creation of light came the creation of time. And in this week's Torah portion and more, we see finer details about how to keep time and sanctify time. Verse after verse describe our annual cycle of holy days and the accompanying rituals. Our calendar of sacred days is described in four out of the 5 books of Torah, each one reinforcing another, each one with its own emphasis and its own innovation. Now, since October 7th, I've been thinking a lot about time and about how history unfolds, and I imagine you have too. Certainly, the past informs the present. This year, Hanukkah's tale of a little light fighting back a terrible and threatening darkness resonated in new ways. This year, Purim's tale of Haman's Jew hatred and Esther's courage resonated in new ways. This year, Pesach's story of redemption from oppression and our ancestors' willingness to walk through the split of the raging waters towards their freedom resonated in new ways. History and sacred myth shape our present tense. It's true. We saw pictures of Israeli soldiers taking time to light little Hanukkah candles while in Gaza and drawing strength from their glow. We heard demonstrators for the hostages echo the words of Moses speaking to Pharaoh, demanding, "Let my people go." And this week we braced ourselves for a Yom HaZikaron like no other, a memorial day for the fallen soldiers of Israel like no other. When I was in Israel for the second time since October 7th, when I was there in February, I met up with some of our former Shinshinim, our young Israeli ambassadors who come and spend a year with us. One of them, you may recall, is Bar Shani, now Bar Ginsburg. I met her and her beautiful little boy, Yonatan. We went to a park and I gave him some Canadian Smarties. Bar was then very, very pregnant, and her husband was still off in reserves. And this week, our congregant, Mike Morgulis, who is still in touch with many of our Shinshinim, shared this story with me about Bar and her family. Hi, Yael. I was speaking with Bar yesterday. I asked her about Yom HaZikaron, and she said she'd had a difficult conversation with Yonatan, who is nearly 3 years old. She said, "I had to tell him that when we hear the sirens tonight, and when we hear the sirens tomorrow morning, we do not need to run to the bomb shelters. These sirens are for Yom HaZikaron, and they sound the same as the other sirens, but they mean something very different. These are remembering sirens, not danger sirens." And then she explained to her not yet 3-year-old Yonatan why it's important to remember. This is the most quintessentially Jewish kind of heartbreak story I can think of. A young Jewish mother who was an accomplished soldier herself not long ago is now training her little boy not to run like he's had to run on and off for 7 months now, but rather to remember. How do we distinguish the siren's call to run from danger from the siren's call to remember? It's a very important to distinguish, because not every memory signals danger. Not every memory triggers trauma. With some training and some courageous role models, even painful memories of terror and loss can steel us to simply and steadfastly stand, to stand still, with our heads held high and our shoulders square. We do not always need to run. Sometimes the siren wails, and the right response is to be still, to pause, to reflect on the past, to learn from it, and to plan a different way forward, to map out new steps for a new future, to walk towards a trajectory to an entirely different kind of future. A lot of Jews in Israel and throughout the diaspora are asking themselves, are we forever trapped in the cycle of history? The ancient rabbis would answer yes and no. On the one hand, they teach that no moment in time is entirely unique. The rabbis prefer to see the parallels that tie the past to the present, and they search them out in our endless texts. This is how the rabbis make sense out of the present tense, by noticing hints from the past, like when a smell triggers a memory of a grandmother's perfume, but we know we aren't really back in her arms again. The rabbis take comfort in knowing that we have been somewhere like this before. Whether good or bad, it is comforting to know we or our ancestors have known something like this before, and they have endured it, and so will we. And on the other hand, the rabbis did not assume that history repeats itself. The most dramatic example is with the destruction of the Second Temple and the second forced exile, this time by the Romans. The rabbis taught that it was both like and unlike the destruction of the First Temple and the first exile forced by the Babylonians. The rabbis predicted that there would be another return to the land of Israel, and there would be the building of a third temple, but not a fourth and not a fifth. No, the third temple would be the forever temple. The pattern would end there. The independence would hold in the land, and peace and justice would hold in the land. And so history echoes, but it isn't repetitive. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, one of the greatest teachers of Torah was Nechama Leibovich. My father was among the many students who literally sat at her feet in her crowded Jerusalem apartment just to drink in her masterful teaching. Once in 1957, on her national radio program, on the weekly Torah portion, it was the week of Parashat Vayishlach, which includes the wrestling match between Jacob and an unidentifiable man. Some commentators, you recall, believe that that mystery man may have been none other than Esau, Jacob's brother. And in the wake of the bloody battles between the growing Jewish population of the young Jewish state and their Arab neighbors, Nechama Leibovich said, "Everything that happened to our ancestor Jacob with his brother Esav will always happen to us and with the children of Esav." She taught that history, by definition, repeats itself, and we are forever locked into recurring rounds of conflict, age after age, God forbid. Listening to her radio program that day was none other than Hugo Bergman, a philosopher who came from Prague to Israel in the 1920s. He was the director of Israel's National Library, and together with Martin Buber, Hugo Bergman founded Brit Shalom, an organization for a binational solution for promoting the coexistence of Jews and Arabs in the State of Israel. Bergman was awarded the highest prize in the land, the Israel Prize, not once, but twice for his contributions to the Jewish state. So when Professor Bergman heard Leibovich's public assertion that Jews and Arabs were forever locked in painful opposition, he wrote her a letter. And I will thank my teacher, Ilana Stein-Hain of the Hartman Institute, for bringing these letters to my attention just this week. Hugo Bergman wrote, "I feel obligated to tell you how much pain you have caused me through your commentary on the narrative of the meeting of Jacob and Esau. I was shocked. Do you understand that you are sowing hatred for humanity in the hearts of the learners and the listeners? Even if based on our history, it's possible to understand this narrow-hearted approach of the commentators, it is permissible to continue this terrible anti-human tradition once we have a state. Is this how we will transform the beginning of our redemption into a full redemption?" What is Bergman saying here? He says, no, history never repeats itself. It doesn't even rhyme, as Twain suggests. There are always new factors at play that make for an entirely different constellation of potential and possibility. And in this story, the story of the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau, the story is entirely new now because we have a third temple in the Jewish state. Not physically, but metaphorically, a third temple in the Jewish state. And then Leibovich writes back to her friend Bergman, "I was bewildered when I read your words. As a teacher and as an educator, I do not wish to erase from the hearts of our students all that has befallen our people, not the Crusades, not Spain, not the Cossack massacre, and certainly not the Holocaust of our own time. And you will agree with me that to teach love of humanity qua humanity with a hope that in the end of days we will all be together, you do not have to do so by hiding what they did to us, by erasing what they did to us." So while Bergman is saying, do not be so narrow, Nechama, in your view of history, Leibovich is saying, Hugo, don't be so naive in yours. Just because we have a state now doesn't mean we're not in danger. It doesn't mean people still don't want to hurt us. So Bergman writes back again and says, "You may think that I'm naive about the nations of the world, but I think you're naive about what we are capable of." And now listen to this warning he gives. "I feel all the danger lies in ambush for us through the self-justification with which we educate ourselves as though we wouldn't have been better than other people, given that we are all made of crooked wood like all human beings, but they are simply wicked." What is he saying here? The real danger of Jewish history is that we have suffered for so long that we have convinced ourselves that it would be impossible for us to hurt other people once we acquire power. But that is not true. Bergman says we are human beings like all human beings, capable of wonderful and terrible things. So we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful to not lock ourselves into history. We must create a new story. And they are both right. In my opinion, Leibovich and Bergman, Nechama and Hugo are both painfully right. This debate between two mid-century Zionists, between two lovers of Israel, between two scholars of Judaism and scholars of Jewish history. It already took place 70 years ago, and it is still our debate today. We are locked in this debate about whether or not we are locked into the wheel of history, doomed to repeat and repeat and repeat, because this is the way of the world? Or is this an unnecessary, self-imposed repetition, a kind of fate of our own making because we are so bound up in history and so loyal to the memory of those who came before us that we are unwilling and therefore unable to even look up and to see the possibilities right in front of us? Leibovich and Bergman remained true friends for many years after this heated exchange of letters. And there is a lesson in that too. This is the conversation we must be willing and able to have among friends. It isn't an effective conversation to have with people who are far from us. You may have tried and failed, but it is a conversation, never let go of it, to have with those who want the same things, who want the same future, but may believe there is another path to get there. One more word about this week's Torah portion, which describes Sfirat HaOmer, the counting of the 49 days between Pesach and Shavuot, between the shores of the sea and the foot of the mountain. It is noteworthy that our custom is to count the Omer up, not down. It isn't a countdown to Sinai. Why? Because the Israelites didn't know how many days it would take to get there. Nor did they know how many years it would take of wandering in the wilderness before we would reach the promised land. Nevertheless, the Torah does not describe us as the people who were slaves, but rather as the people who were freed from slavery. The Torah does not describe us as the people who were aimlessly wandering in the wilderness, but rather the people who received Torah and its moral code, giving us direction and a path forward. The Torah does not describe us as the people who were homeless, rather the people who were on the march homeward. How do we remember? Or as Jonathan Safran Foer asks, what does it remember like? How do we tell our stories so as not to be trapped by them, but rather propelled by them? Are we the people who were murdered by Nazis? Yes, by the millions. And we are also the people who survived them and went on to establish Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. Are we the people who were slaughtered and taken captive by Hamas? Yes, by the hundreds. And we are also the people who know this is not how the story ends. Are we the people who are made the objects of scorn in the international court, the objects of slander on university campuses, the objects of micro and macro aggressions in the workplace, on social media, and on the streets of our city? Yes, by the thousands. And we are also the people who know full well, the people who believe with a perfect faith, be'emunah shlema, that this is not how the story ends. Jewish memory is long. Jewish memory may rhyme, but the possibilities for change are very real. With courage, with imagination, with the partnership of good people everywhere, and with the blessing of the infinite God who is beyond time, we can bend the arc of history in ways that are entirely new. Ken Yehi Ratzon.